Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar with Dr. Amanda Tattersall. My name is Kevin and I look forward to spending some time with you today. I would like to start by first acknowledging the traditional owners of countries throughout Australia. I pay my deep respect to elders past, present and future. I invite you to ground yourself, place yourself on country and connect with country where you are today. Currently on screen is a maroon PowerPoint holding slide with some text and video boxes of our guest and Auslan interpreters. I, the host, am a fair-skinned man with brown hair and wearing a blue shirt today. Welcome to this week's first Creative Connections session, everyone. Our aim with Creative Connections is to support you during this complex period and to equip you with new skills and capabilities to recover together. These webinars are designed to be bite-sized and quick learning moments, and I encourage you to keep exploring, keep sharing, and keep engaging with us. We look forward to also seeing you to other sessions this week, focusing on leadership and digital adaptation. Before I introduce you to our fantastic guest today, I have a few housekeeping items to remind you of. Firstly, a recording of today's webinar will be available at the end of the session and you will receive a separate email with a link to the recording. Then, as usual, our live captioning is available and you can access this via the closed caption feature in Zoom by clicking on that feature at the bottom of your screen. To make sure that you can see the Auslan interpreters, please make sure that your view is set to gallery view. We recommend you use a desktop or a laptop because Zoom on a mobile device has less functionality. Next, we would love to hear from you. As usual, if you've got a question to ask, please pop that into the Q&A section, which again, you can find at the bottom of your screen in the player bar. We will answer those questions at the end of Amanda's session, and apologies if we can't get to yours. And at any point, if you need any help, please raise your hand. You can do this virtually by clicking on the hand raise feature, again at the bottom of the screen. And the team, Ian, Francis, and Laura, is in the background ready to help out. Otherwise, just shoot us a quick email. We're also monitoring our emails during these sessions. And don't forget to share your comments, your ideas, and your examples in the chat area. So currently on screen is a PowerPoint slide again with some text and a photo to introduce our guest speaker. The image is of a woman in front of a podium holding a mic. What are the most effective ways for organizing and advocating in times of crisis? How do we advocate for the long term if we are currently focusing on the immediate? How do we become better advocates? And what is your and my role in advocacy? Amanda's experience, knowledge, and success as a community organizer and advocate makes her the best person to be having this conversation with. Several months ago, I had the opportunity to join one of Amanda's masterclasses on advocacy. And I'm delighted to introduce you to her today. Amanda, amongst many things, is currently a researcher and educator at the Sydney Policy Lab at the Sydney University, and previously have been involved in establishing a range of really significant organising groups, such as the Sydney Alliance and also Get Up. Amanda is the host of the podcast called Changemakers. If you've not done so already, I highly recommend you check it out. We'll hear a little bit about what she normally covers in today's session. My favorite episode, Amanda, was the Reclaim the City in Cape Town in South Africa. Of course, I might be a bit biased because that's where I am originally from, but I've really been enjoying your podcast. So thank you so much for being here today. And listen, your session comes at a timely and a critical moment for us as a sector to engage with. So welcome, and I'll hand over to you. And I think you've got some slides to share with us as well. Thanks, Amanda.
Thank you, Kevin, and welcome to everyone who is on the call. I'm just setting myself up. So I'm so delighted to be here talking with the arts community, the artistic community, and I really thank you all for having me here. So it was about a year ago. I too remember the time that Kevin got in touch with me. It was a little bit out of the blue. He sent me a delightful email to say, would you like to come and have a chat with the Australia Council? And, you know, to be honest, I was quite honoured to receive such a request, because to be honest with you all, despite being a deep admirer of the arts, I never totally felt like I was part of your gang. You know, I do social change. I whenever I'm struggling with what to do in terms of social change, I end up going to the university and doing some research. But that felt like a lifetime away from being part of the artistic community. But my relationship with Kevin and Wendy Worth over time has shifted my thinking on who the arts community is. And indeed, it's made me reflect on who I am. So when I was, you know, just to give you a little bit of a sense. So when I was young, I was a passionate musician. And music is really important, a really important part of my life. So much so that I make both my kids play 2 instruments in ways, and I play with them still, actually. I play my clarinet along with them. And that is both a great thing for our family life and also possibly counterproductive at times, but, you know, it's mainly beautiful. And I also love comedy. I've always loved comedy since I was a kid. And my love is so deep for comedy that I ended up marrying a comedian. So there you go. That's lifelong commitment to that form of art. And then 4 years ago, I decided to take my love of social change and turn it into a piece of art, which is the podcast called Changemakers. Now, look, I know that every single person you know does a podcast in their garage. I do actually like to think of ours as not too bad. We try and follow the This American Lifestyle of nonfiction narrative of really focusing on the storytelling of people who are involved in social change in specific campaigns. And that's kind of worked. We've got over 500,000 downloads. And it all led to the point that when I was talking to Kevin and Wendy, I thought for the first time, am I an artist? But regardless of the answer, I am delighted to be here. And so I'm here to talk about advocacy. And I guess I want to say that this question about how to advocate has been my vocational pursuit since I was at university and joined the student movement over 20 years ago. I've studied social change, I've worked in social change, and it is how to make the world a better place is like what gets me up in the morning and what occupies my mind as I go to sleep at night. But actually, it's worth remembering that my passion, your passion, doesn't start with our first act of change. My energy comes a lot from my grandma's story in North England, where she tried to battle poverty and World War II and her political interpretations of her struggles. And it was her struggles that shaped me as I was learning to walk. Like your journey to the arts, like all of our journeys in life, we have a public narrative, a story about who we are. And we're going to touch on this story here today briefly. We can't get into it in full detail, but at the end, I'll let you know about some further training if you think that this is a useful and compelling thing that you want to explore in more detail. So let's move to the topic of hand, the idea of long-term advocacy in a moment of crisis. So I want to start by taking stock of where we are right now, because this is an overwhelming moment for our lives, for our careers, for everything. And certainly it is the biggest public health crisis we have ever seen. And look, the bigness of it all can lead us sometimes to a bad place. You know, how are we going to get out? What are we going to do? It can lead us to a place of panic. So I want to start with a story about another crisis, because actually we have experienced moments that feel cataclysmic before. And it is in crises past that there are concrete lessons that we can apply to this moment now, including lessons about how we can build powerful advocacy. So I want to take you all on a trip to Barcelona. If I can click the screen correctly. Let's see how this goes. There we go. See, magic. So Barcelona 2008. So we're in Barcelona, and this is on the screen is a picture of the Sagrada Familia, big cathedral in Barcelona. We're in Barcelona because because of all the cities in Europe, if not the world, the global financial crisis in 2008 caused the deepest housing crisis there. Spain has always had a thing for home ownership since the time of Franco. Franco thought that if people owned their own homes, they'd be less likely to rise up in rebellion against him. And he built a lot of incentives to encourage home ownership. Consequently, most people had a mortgage. But in the lead up to the 2008 financial crisis, Spain had a housing bubble. When the financial crisis hit, evictions were widespread. To give you a sense of the scale of it, in between 2009 and 2020, there have been over 1 million evictions. Let's just clarify that. 1 million families, people, removed from their homes and made homeless. But thankfully, like now, just then, no crisis goes unanswered. So in 2009, a very modest organisation formed called LAPA. It means the platform for people affected by mortgages. It works to bring together people who are being evicted and people who are being threatened with eviction. They would hold meetings. And one of the things that they noticed in these very early meetings was that people who had been evicted or were threatened with eviction felt deeply ashamed. They felt like failures. The deep in your stomach kind of failure, the wake up at 3 a.m. in the middle of the night on your own looking at the ceiling kind of failure. But the organisers at LAPA knew it wasn't their fault that they had been evicted. This was a crisis, a widespread crisis, but people still had that feeling. And this feeling at times could be a barrier. It made it hard for them to do advocacy and want to do advocacy because at some level they felt that what they were experiencing was their fault. So LAPA created a space for people to talk this through together. And over time, this welcome assembly where people were able to come together, those facing eviction would talk about their worries and possible experiences coming, and those who had already experienced it would coach those other people in how to respond to it. They gave advice. So there was a radicalness in this moment. So instead of having an expert, a lawyer, someone who stands over you and tells you what to do, the community of people being evicted were coaching each other, a little like the community of people that are on this call. The idea was that you could solve each other's problems together by sharing your collective intelligence. This created a shift in the community. People became bolder. People started to believe they could make change. In my world, this kind of work has a name. It's called organising, and I'll put a few links to it at the end of the chat. Organising is about building people up as leaders, supporting new people to have a voice, to be strong. So following the Arab Spring and the mass demonstrations in Iceland, Spain also demonstrated. On the 15th of May 2011, it's called 15M sometimes, 7 million people around the country protested out of a population of 23 million. They were called the Indignados, as you can see on the picture where people are holding a banner saying Indignados, the angry ones. This was not a fringe protest. It literally was everyone. It was very mainstream. It was 1/6 of the Spanish population joined physical protests in the cities. It was the Spanish equivalent of the protests against the war in Iraq that some of you may have attended in 2003, except it was even bigger than that. It was a pinnacle of mass mobilisation. In my world, we call this kind of protest mobilising. This is a form of advocacy that we call mobilising, and it's different to an organising strategy. It was successful as a statement of power. There was a collective spirit in that moment, but it was also limited. The protest ended, the politicians remained. People felt emboldened, which was great, but the policies didn't change. But the rally itself wasn't the only goal. It was used to create momentum for the political activity that followed. So, interestingly, La Paz organisers got involved in that rally, in the mass movement, and drew people into their housing campaign. And the housing campaign grew. They had clear aims and goals. Over 1 million people signed a petition for policy reform on housing. From the protests, people joined eviction blockades to stop physically using their bodies to stop evictions. This tension attracted attention. One of their leaders, and I've got an arrow pointed to a woman with brown hair in the middle with a green La Paz t-shirt on. One of their leaders, Ada Colau, became a national spokesperson and go-to person in this crisis when she called the head of the Banking Association, one of the people responsible for the evictions, a criminal. So, those things were creative, sure, but they had nothing on what happened next. So, some of those activists from La Paz, they lost many of those battles around housing. They fought the good fight, but the politicians didn't listen. So a bunch of those activists who frankly hated political parties decided to form a political party called Barcelona en Camus, which means welcome Barcelona, to challenge the corrupt powers that be and build their own gateway into the city of Barcelona. They did. On the screen is a woman, Ada Colau, no longer housing activist, but she's the mayor of Barcelona, and she's been elected twice, elected again last year. And there's a comment underneath her face that says, "Is this the world's most radical mayor?" from The Guardian. And that is a good question to ask. So that's really interesting stuff, right? So let's just take stock what they did in the 7 years post a crisis in Barcelona. So they were in shock. People had been evicted from their homes. Most people felt shame and embarrassment. So La Paz built a close, intimate space for people to find their own voice. There were mass mobilizations across the city that brought out 1/6 of the population of Spain to the streets. They pushed for radical reform on questions of housing that 90% of the population were in support of. And then when the politicians wouldn't support them, they created their own institutions to make change. In this case, it was a political party to prosecute their campaign when the old ways weren't working. Now, pause, right? I want you to look closely at this because the lessons aren't in the tactics. They're in the advocacy tools that they harnessed. I just want to clarify, I'm not here to say, oh, right, what we need now is a radical political party called the Arts Party. That is not the lesson that I'm suggesting. What I'm suggesting is something that sits underneath what went on in this activity that we can draw out as lessons for advocacy in a crisis. And I find that there are 4 lessons. First, we need to understand the power that we have and the power that we need to build. They did that acutely. 2, coalitions are important. You can rarely do this kind of stuff on your own. How do you build powerful relationships with other people? And hint, not all coalitions are built very powerfully or very effectively. 3, the stories that we tell are incredibly important. Our public narrative, our testimony, the frame that we use actually is our vehicle for change, our message for change, and we need to get that right. And 4thly, our power is somewhat dependent on how creative we are, how out of the box we can be with how we conceive of what we're fighting for and what change we want to see. They were creative, and their creativity is an invitation for us to also be creative. And just a note on the slide, if people want to know more about that story, it's covered in the first episode of Changemakers, episode 1, the second half of that episode. It's a cool story. The Barcelona's people are cool. Let's be clear. So, lesson 1. In order to understand how we make change, to take on powerful advocacy, you need to understand power. That means having a very realistic understanding of the power you actually have, what you are actually up against, and a strategy to manage the gap. Right now, in the middle of COVID, in the middle of the corona crisis, everything feels up in the air. It's very difficult to make concrete assessments of how much power we do have or don't have. 1 minute Scott Morrison is doubling Newstart. That seems good. The next minute, the government is transforming our industrial relations system while continuing to ignore the need for a massive injection into the arts. It's a very confusing time. So it's hard to interpret what's going on. So it's almost like we need a framework to help us interpret that. And luckily, I've got one. So let's run through it. So on the screen are 3 circles with words in the middle of them, and they're of even size. And this is a picture of the democratic public arena. And the 3 circles say market, government, and community. When I refer to market, and it's a picture of our democracy, right? And it's got 3 main sectors. The first is our market. So there we think the business community, the for-profit community. Then on the other side is government, and we can think about our politicians, and we can also think about our public servants. And then on the bottom is the community, and we can think of civil society, the organisations. You can think of not-for-profit organisations, NGOs. You can think of religious organisations. You can think of unions, even little organisations like your school's P&C, or even your family, are all examples of parts of civil society. Now, a very lovely writer, a guy called Karl Polanyi, wrote a book after World War II saying that this 3 even-sized sectors between the market, government and community, that is a picture of what a good democracy would look like. Each sector would be the same. So it's not particularly revolutionary. He wasn't so into revolutions because he'd just experienced fascism and seen Stalinism. What he wanted was a space that was deeply democratically accountable, where everyone can hold each other to account when someone does something wrong. So the government steps out of kilt, the community can step in. When the market steps out of kilt, the government can step in, and vice versa. When someone does something wrong, they can be held to account. That makes for a good democracy, because democracy is about accountability. So that would be beautiful. I'm sure everyone's looking at that going, wow, that would be a lovely place to live in, because we do not live in a place like that at the moment. Let's just then jump to where we were pre-pandemic. So for those, just to lay out what's on the screen, we've got like this really big obese market, and it's got this sort of hands clipped into the government, sort of holding it tight, not letting it go. And then we've got this sort of tiny little community at the bottom, struggling to influence anyone, poor little community. So arguably, we could have a debate about it, except I think you're all on silent and I'm the only one speaking, but we could have a debate at another time. This is a fair depiction of the kind of power relations that we had seen in society up until the pandemic. We see it in policies, deregulation, industrial relations reform, but we also see it in cultures, a culture of intensive KPIs, intense competition, managerial professionalism. These cultures are also market cultures, and they seep across to our government, and they seep into our community sector as well. There's a sort of dominance of market power and market behaviour in our public arena. And it's a reflection of the fact that many institutions, including the arts community, don't have a lot of power when lobbying government. Not just this government, just government, right? Under a neoliberal economy, the arts community hasn't had a lot of power in lobbying government. They aren't taken as seriously. And some others experience that too. So what next? And this slide has a big question mark over that framework. So lots of strange things have happened in the last couple of months that can make it difficult to interpret. So firstly, the government looks like it's doing some Keynesian pump priming. It's sending money across the economy. Newstart, great. Limited evictions, changes to childcare. Look, that all looks good. Maybe government's changed and its relationship to the market has changed and it's serving community more. Maybe, but look closer. The interventions that have occurred have somewhat been shaped by the interests of the market. Let's not forget that the power relations shape policy. So childcare and schools returning are highly shaped by wanting people to get back to work, even ahead of the public health needs. Ending the lockdown has a lot to do with ending business continuity insurance payouts, less maybe to do with ending the virus. The jobs guarantee program, where the money goes to governments at 80% of your salary, also includes the right for employers to be able to change your workplace agreements within 24 hours. That's not quite as nice as it felt like when it was announced. There's been widespread industrial relations reforms proposed, and the arts has totally missed out on major support and intervention. Feels like some of the power relations that used to play out are present in this space, right? The circles give us a sense of understanding who is being helped. It isn't totally random. It's based on their relative power. So what will become of this space? Do we all just sort of give up and go home because it seems terribly depressing? Well, no. Look to Barcelona. What will become of this crisis is up to us. But what is required is to not just assume that good things will happen because there's been a crisis. To get more support, we need to build and demonstrate our power, a better power, a nicer power, community power. So this talk is based on identifying strategies that the art sector can use to organise its power. And let me signal a couple of little ideas. So the first is power is about being visible, right? Being actually taken seriously because you are visible. It's hard to be visible in this moment, but it is about being visible. One of the ways that we make ourselves visible is through our stories. But I want to put out there something about storytelling. Storytelling is really different from shouting, right? So sometimes when we are really angry at people, we go out and we shout at them and we feel a bit better. You know, that can make us feel sort of internally happier that we have got that off our chest. But it's not good art to shout, and it's not good politics to shout either. Stories, good stories, always have an audience in mind. Stories are weak if they are just about shouting. There's nothing dramatic about yelling from the stage constantly. And we need to think about our audience. We need to think about who's listening to our stories if we're going to be persuasive and powerful. So the three circles gives us a sense of, gives us information about our listener. The first is that it says that the people who we really want to listen to as government are actually interested in listening to the market. And like it or lump it, we should be alert to that relationship when we're building our campaigns and being aware of that. So what do you do about that? Okay, so we could do a lot more gathering of support in the community to make our community circle much bigger, right? So one way to build our power is actually literally to increase the size of our community. That's about building coalitions, building relationships with unlikely supporters, people outside of our traditional network, and also everyday people as well. It's also about breaking down what this government circle looks like. Like, government isn't a blob. Government is actually something that we can theorize, analyze. We talk about power analysis in organising. I'm not going to get into that today, but it's an important concept where we can seek to understand the interests of those operating so we can understand how to shift them. For instance, you all know this, but the Liberal Party, National Party coalition, with the National Party, there's a heap of regional arts networks and centres that have quite a lot of important influence over those National Party members, and that could be a vehicle for being able to be heard in the halls of power, as I'm sure, as I know you know. And then the third one is just our audience listens to the market. This might be a useful time to talk to some of our market allies. Might be. So if we're talking about building big community connections, this leads to my second lesson that comes out of Barcelona. How do we respond to how do we build advocacy in a long-term crisis? Well, we could build powerful coalitions. So it's incredibly rare that any organisation or group can achieve sufficient change on its own, especially on the big questions. They usually need to work with others. So they work in coalition. That's what happened in Barcelona. La Paz were not superheroes. They worked in partnership with a variety of different other organisations, not just in housing, across a multitude of issue areas. And indeed, Barcelona on Camus was actually a network of different groups as well. They shared interests, and it was by combining their interests and campaigns that they were able to be successful. So what is a coalition? So a coalition is where two or more organisations work together on a common goal to achieve an impact. Now, I know that sounds pretty obvious, but if we break it down, we can draw out a whole bunch of lessons about effective coalition practice. So firstly, there's a triangle with three concepts on it: organisational relationships, common concern, and impact. And I'm going to run through each of them in turn. The first one is organisational relationships. Okay, so the first part of a coalition is that two or more organisations come together. So they have some kind of a relationship. Well, the kind of relationship they have varies the kind of coalition that is produced. It could be super loose. There could be no meetings. One group just calls everyone else to hand over their letterhead or sign onto a press release. This happens all the time. That's one type of coalition. Another type of coalition is one with lots of meetings. Can't have enough meetings, incredibly boring, stolid meetings that, kill you with boredom and, they're so painful and you just want to never be a part of them. That's another type of coalition that happens quite a lot. Happens in my world. Don't know if it happens in your world, but I'm sure it happens in lots of places. And they can be just awful. And then the third type of coalition is where you can use some more subtle practices, organising practices, that phrase I used from earlier, that focuses on relationship building, trust building, listening, these really important elements of powerful advocacy to focus relationships and small groups to make a coalition really powerful. The second element, so you want to work together on something in common. That's called common concern. Coalitions can be staged around small things to big things. You can have an event that is a coalition, or you can have a big multi-year agenda with multiple areas of concern and a log of claims, and it's all dramatic. All of those things are examples of something that you can work on in coalition. They're highly varied. And then the final one is impact. So you want to impact. The question of impact is about who are you influencing? And there are always two communities of people that you are influencing in a coalition. One is a decision maker. You want an impact on an issue. You want to win something. You want to win change. You want to make an impact on an outsider. But then impact is also something you want internally. If I'm ever building a coalition, I want to make sure I'm increasing the leadership skills and capacity of all the people in our organisation who are active to make them stronger for the next battle ahead. Impact can be both external and internal. But the other thing about impact is you've got to think about geography. So the actual geography of the issue that you're working on and the community that you're working with shapes the kind of impact that you have. For instance, I was heavily involved in the refugee movement 20 years ago, 15 years ago, and we really struggled to influence John Howard, you won't be shocked, but we also struggled to influence the Labor Party because we were seen as too inner city, and we did not have engagement and representation and participation actively in, say, the western suburbs of Sydney. It was a weakness of ours. And that weakness stayed with me a long time because it was a question of actually your geographic presence is incredibly important to being able to build political influence. And sometimes those geographic gaps are what's keeping us back from having the influence that we want. Okay, so that's a nice background. Let me draw out three key lessons. The first is less is more. So this is the most counterintuitive lesson of coalition building. Everyone thinks more is more groups, more power, but actually that is not true at all. Actually, more groups is just really messy. The picture on the left of this slide is a picture of the peace movement in 2003, the anti-war movement against the war in Iraq. And we had an enormous coalition of 90 organisations who frankly didn't like each other very much. They were way too politically diverse and ideologically diverse, and we didn't spend any time getting to know each other. And the distrust actually meant that we deteriorated the strategy, and we ended up the coalition fell apart not long after the war went ahead. In contrast, the picture on the right is a picture of the front cover of the Tony Vincent report that the Public Education which was a public education campaign around the same time. And they won a $250 million class sizes campaign with just two organisations, the Teachers Federation and the Federation of Parents and Citizens. Less is more because they were able to strategize, they were able to work together, they were able to work through differences and complaints and issues they had with each other far more effectively than just some enormous cumbersome network. Less is more can be incredibly powerful. And less is more can also be about bringing surprising allies to the table as well. So it's not just about less very familiar faces. It could be less really unusual organisations working together on a problem. The second lesson is you want to build coalitions based on people's mutual interests, not just your interests. You've got to find out what their interests are, which means you've got to listen to what the other groups are thinking about. So often when we work in coalition, certainly I have experienced this, you get really evangelistic about how important your stuff is, and you forget to find out what everyone else cares about. And therefore it's very difficult to build creative coalitions because you're so pushing and you're being a sort of salesperson for your own agenda. You're not seeking to be able to weave different interests together. The magic of coalitions is about that weaving. You know, for now, we could think there's a lot of weaving to be done. For instance, imagine a campaign to build a lot more public housing. That would be jobs creation. The unions maybe you're happy about that could also build those houses carbon neutral, so the climate campaign could come on board. There's a bunch of mutual interests in a campaign like that, not just a single interest. So how do you find these issues? Well, you don't just find them by thinking really hard, you know, sit at your desk and sort of scratch your brain and an issue, a multi-interest campaign pops out. You go and find them through listening, building relationships with people who are different to you, finding out what other people care about and putting them and connecting those issues together into new, interesting campaigns. The third lesson is about the power of geography. So we often think of advocacy as one-dimensional and our targets as disembodied, but actually everything in terms of political power exists in places. So politicians sit in Canberra or in Macquarie Street. I'm in Sydney, they could sit in Macquarie Street, but they also sit in every electorate, and there are representatives in every single electorate who can be advocated to by people in those electorate. And there's quite a lot of influence that people have if you're lobbying people in your own electorate. The Your Rights at Work campaign in 2005 to 2007 did this brilliantly. A lot of people remember that campaign because of the great ads that they did with Tracy worried on the phone and the big mobilisations. But the thing that actually made that campaign powerful was that they ran this marginal seats campaign in 20 seats around the country and had a lot of influence at a local level. Now, I'm not suggesting you do something like that. That would be much more partisan. But being present geographically across the country is something that is powerful, and you'd have to make decisions about where you'd want to be. Where is the most strategic space to influence the arts? Is it in marginal seats? Is it in safe seats, so you've got a long-term relationship with key people? Is it where the ministers sit, or is it somewhere else? You'd need to think about those decisions, but they're the questions to ask. Where physically in the country need you organise? In the refugee movement, we weren't in Western Sydney, and that was to our loss. Where do you need to be that's new? So they're core lessons, and I will flick these slides, this information around later. But if you want to know more about coalitions, helpfully, another episode of Changemaker Podcast. My gosh, what a great podcast. People should consider listening to that. So another episode is on coalitions, episode 2. I did write a book on this. That's why I'm so obsessed. And I will flick an excerpt from that book. That's just a short piece about that Teachers Federation Coalition. If people are interested, they can have a look at it. So, third lesson, going to move quickly so we can have some good questions. The third lesson from Barcelona is one I mentioned at the time, which is the power of story. Now, I know you know this. The power of story is something that is intimately built into the work of the arts community. But sometimes it's nice to be reminded that actually you have the strength already, and part of it is about tapping a strength that you have professionally and placing it into the political realm, because actually this is an incredibly important part of powerful advocacy. Let me draw out a couple of practices that are particularly important. The first is testimony. Our stories matter. Statistics and data and evidence are all vital, but they are never enough. You can go and ask the climate scientists how that's gone for them. Good data is only ever heard when it is told as a story, as a rich narrative where our personal and public lives intersect. So we have, surprisingly, a framework that helps you explain what this means. In organising, we call this revealing the public dimensions of our private lives. So I can tell you about how terrible housing is in Spain by giving you stats. That's a public dimension. But in Barcelona, La Paz did not do this. They worked with people directly affected by the housing crisis and helped them tell their story of it, how the public pressure was impacting their lives, causing stress, what homelessness meant. They helped people to articulate the public pressure of their lives. And these were the stories that they told. Not too public. 16,000 people have this. No, not like that. Not too private. Not, when I sleep on the street, like not too private. In the middle of the Venn diagram. On the screen is a Venn diagram. On one side is public, on one side is private, and the two circles overlap. In the center is where we want to tell these stories. Not exclusively private, not exclusively public. So narrative is another way, which is just narrative frames is an important way of thinking about our stories. And these are the overarching stories that we tell about the world that link to the specific stories that we tell. So this guy called George Lakoff, his book is on the slide, Don't Think of an Elephant. He had a theory, this book is 15 years old, that there are two types of stories about what we seek from the world. And you'll love this, right? So there's the stern dad, and at the time he was writing about George Bush, but Peter Dutton. And then there's the cuddly mum, the nurturing mum, and he talked about Oprah Winfrey. I like to think about Jacinta Ardern, the nurturing character. Now, both of them are important, powerful public figures. There's not actually a statement that one is better than the other. They're both potent, they're both powerful. And it's important to know which side of that framework your argument lies, because you want to keep invoking that side of the framework consistently. And if you jump across the framework, if you pretend to be nurturing and then you argue you're stern, people don't believe you, and vice versa. It's about believability. This is the values frame that he argues actually is built into our brains. And the reason why he says that's important is because if you, he calls the book Don't Think of an Elephant, because if I say, oh, don't think of an elephant, the first thing you'll do is think of an elephant. And it's the same for frames. If I say, oh, don't think about security, you're thinking about security. Don't think about tax cuts, you're thinking about tax cuts. You need to be on the other side of the frame, the nurture frame, and build up a narrative on that side. The relevance for the arts community is simply that we've just got to be really clear on which side of the frame that we're working on. And my assessment is that the arts community is a nurturing frame, a supportive, loving frame. It's a wonderful mum with beautiful men as well, playing the role of mum. But also it shows the kind of coalitions we can build, building coalitions with other nurturing frames, like people who are worried about climate change, people who want public healthy communities, supported communities, educated communities. These are nurturing frames. These are rich places for us to build relationships. So that's story. Final lesson. We're almost there, friends. The final lesson is creativity. So Barcelona, the political party. Unbelievable. Never been done like that before. Radical. It's set a sort of set of thinking on fire about political parties. I am not here to talk about how you need a political party. As I mentioned earlier, that would be, the worst distraction in the universe. But what I do think it's about is thinking about what does creativity mean in this moment, and how are you investing in radical, out-of-the-box creative thinking, the kind of creative thinking that wouldn't have thought being possible before the crisis. It is now open. The crisis has opened up our ability to think differently. So, is the creative thinking about trying to reimagine the role of arts and its connection to our road out of this crisis? The fact is that the arts is the most extraordinary space for us to be able to interpret how this crisis has affected us and reconnect with each other. Is it about recognizing the collective experience of art, and that actually that sense of being in something together physically is so powerful, and that the art speaks to that? Is it about the fact that the arts is a low carbon industry and that it should embrace that? Is it about thinking how arts has radical digital formats? I don't know. You know these things. I am still grappling with the fact that whether I'm an artist or not. But you have to ask these questions and embrace this creativity. So creativity doesn't happen fast. It's what Daniel Kahneman called type 2 thinking. It happens slowly and evocatively. You need to turn your brain to it. But we need to create space for this in the midst of panic and again, crisis. We need to create space, find ways to be able to come together and have these imaginative thoughts, if we can, to be able to create our vision, our nurturing frame for the future of our world, lest someone else create a vision for us. So this is part of your job too. So let me just remind you of the lessons that I saw in Barcelona that I think apply to us. Thinking about power, right? Being very clear and analytical about power, not necessarily scared, but analytical about power, and then building the power that we need to win. 2, building coalitions and thinking differently about coalitions. It's not just building a relationship with everyone we know. It's probably going and finding and creating a relationship with people that we don't. 3, telling powerful stories. You do this well, but thinking about the kind of testimony that we tell and the kind of frames that we speak to. And then being radically creative. Surely something that you guys are excellent for certainly in your professional life. And the question is creating a space to bring that to the political space as well. And then finally, just leaving you with more resources. I'll put these links on the chat when we go to a Q&A thing. The podcast, look, I might as well promote it given no one else can speak back. It's just inspiring. There's so many amazing people out there in the world, and we've captured what they've done with the Hong Kong protests, or Standing Rock, or the March for Our Lives crew in Florida who built a student movement in response to a shooting at their school. These are amazing people. But the cool thing about the podcast is that we then draw out the organising lessons from their story. So it aims to be a very gentle teacher of organising, but in the context of some amazing stories. And you can get it anywhere: Spotify, iTunes, that sort of thing. There is a training program that a few of us via Changemakers have set up on organising, and in a couple of weeks we're teaching public narrative. On Friday we're teaching power. I'll put the link. You can get to it through the Changemakers website, but also I'll put the link for how you can register. If you're even vaguely curious, you can register, and at least you'll get email updates about future sessions if you're interested. And I'll also put some links up to some other reading you can do, if you're interested in following through on questions of organising. And that is me done. Kevin?
Well, thank you so much, Amanda. That was a great session to get us start thinking, and also hopefully that will spark some interest in some of our leaders to go and learn more. I know that I always enhance my understanding of this practice when we meet and when we hang out. So we'll move to some questions if you're okay. There's a bunch of questions that's already in. So just as a reminder, if you've got a question for Amanda, just pop it quickly into the Q&A section and we will try and answer those. So Amanda, we'll sort of start with one. The first one is from Rebecca. Thanks, Rebecca. And her question is maybe a practical question around collaboration. What methods have you researched or experienced that are most successful in establishing long-term and strong relationships between groups? So so you sort of started touching on some, but you have some other thoughts on practical advice?
Yeah, so relationships, there's a motto in organising that says relationships precede action, and that would be the frame that I would bring to, if you want to do long-term collaboration, especially if you want to do something with people who are different to you, but even if you just want to build long-term collaboration that's sincere and less likely to fall apart, I would be building relationships. Now, there's a framework that we use called the relational meeting, which is a particular way of having one-to-one conversations where you explore someone else's interests and you focus on the other person more, as a way of being able to have a conversation. And I did a training on this last Friday, and the video of the training is on the website. So you could watch that if you were really keen, or there's actually a bunch of articles about relational meetings, but that's the best. I mean, I know that that's probably you wanting more structure stuff, but actually if you can build powerful one-to-one relationships where you really know what the other is going on for the other person, anything is possible. That's what I think we tend to not do, is we don't ask enough questions. And I don't just mean tell me all about your organization and what you do. I mean questions like, why did you get into this in the first place? Where did your energy come from? Where did your motivation come from? And really exploring that with people so we have a much fuller understanding of each other. I think we sometimes think that's too invasive or too I don't know. I just think that when we don't do that, we muck up. So the relational meeting, the relationships focused work every time.
Okay, thanks. We've got a few more. So next question is from Rosemary. Rosemary asks that it strikes her that in the arts, sometimes we operate within art form areas, and that each of these art form areas potentially might have different challenges, particularly now in COVID. How important do you think advocacy is within those sort of separate groups, as well as how that happens across those art form areas? Do you have some thoughts or thinking around this, or maybe some other comparable examples that speaks to this?
Look, you always need to play to your specific self-interest, and if you don't, things will fall over. So I think I would never argue that people shouldn't be playing to what's specifically going on in live production versus television. You know what I mean? Like you have to play to the specific interests. You have to understand them intimately. But like you also have to do an analysis about what it's going to take to win and what transformation looks like, or what a positive transformation looks like. And I just don't think that any parts of the arts, no judgment, right? Like is powerful enough to not build interesting collaboration. And so part of it is just holding those two things in tension about being able to build an intimate relationship, but not being so rigid with the boundaries about what you're working on that you can't exchange and explore interconnection with others. For instance, this is not the same, but when I built the Sydney Alliance with lots and lots and lots of other people who are also brilliant, we had unions who could be argued to sort of see themselves as a particular sector and get sort of really excited about their stuff. But we had to have a conversation where it was like, you guys aren't winning, guys. Like, why don't we think about building relationships with the Catholic Church, the Jewish Board of Deputies, the Muslim Women's Association, the Cancer Council, like all these other groups. And when they started to stretch themselves out of their specificity, they started to find things that were actually arguably made them think differently about themselves and opened up their own sense of their own issues. And, the union movement at the moment is running a big, powerful campaign around migrant workers. They just would not have done that if they were thinking too narrowly. So those open relationships actually change how we see the world. And that's really important.
There are so many great questions, but unfortunately we don't have that much time. I think we can do one more if you're okay. This one is from Gemma, and I think it's a great question. Gemma's question is, a lot of advocacy methods are based sometimes around physical gathering and being in close proximity to each other, which of course is not possible right at this moment. Have you come across any examples or sort of ideas around organising in isolation and over distances, and what can we learn maybe from that now, given the situation that we are in?
So, like, what I'm going to say is a real simplification of something, but you could think of two main strands of advocacy as organising and mobilising. And if you thought of it, this is so crude, but organising being the relationship building, the nurturing of networks, the setting things up to be ready to act, and then the mobilizing is the public action. And this is an organizing moment. This is an organizing moment. And I think that we should we should take energy from that. This is a time to contact organisations that you have thought that you should contact but haven't yet, to build relationships with people who you wanted to but didn't know how. Do a power analysis of who you think you need to be in relationship with in your community or your suburb or your electorate or your town that would make your organisation stronger. This is a moment to, there's another phrase in organising, which is all organising is disorganising and reorganising. We need to disorganise the relationships we have to create the relationships we need to be powerful as we go forward. You can't mobilise. Look, I helped set up Get Up. Like even that, you know what I mean? It's like, what are they? Email petitions? They're just not that strong in this moment. But organising relationally is, you can do it on Zoom, you can do it on the phone. There's nothing, I mean, slightly better when you're face to face, right? But we can use these skills right now. And I think if we focus on how can we, this is a moment to build our power. Who do we want to be in relationship with to build our power? So then when things, like even in a month's time, we can be more powerful in using our power. I think that that is potent. Of course, people are going to be in a panic. There isn't a massive amount of money that has come from the federal government, and people are wanting to make for the arts, and people are wanting to make that happen now. And I recognise that what I'm saying is not necessarily easily sitting alongside that. But part of me also feels like this is a long, long journey, and we need to be able to reinvigorate the sector over months and years. And those new powerful relationships are going to be the tools by which we can do it.
That sounds like a great place to conclude. Amanda, thank you so much for your time this morning, and we appreciate you leaving us with some of that knowledge and thought and provocation. So we will, like you said, we will share some of those details. If it's okay with you, we'll also maybe include a lot of those links when we send the recording of this video to everyone as well. So Amanda, thank you so much again for your time. Before we wrap up, just a quick reminder that there are a couple of additional sessions this week. This afternoon, in fact, we are joined by Penny Miles from Circus Oz, and she will be unpacking how we can guide others through significant change. I had a sort of a pre-look at her session, and I highly encourage you to come. So if you haven't registered for that one, just register that. That starts at 3 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time this afternoon. And then also on Friday, we are joined by Google Creative Lab to explore how artists and arts organizations can adapt creatively. And they have been working with a range of artists and organizations, and they are keen to share some of their experiences and some case studies that I hope you will find useful. So thanks again for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks, everyone.